Welcome to episode 54 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.
Not enough teachers in the classrooms. The teacher shortage continues to be a huge problem nationwide.
We are back this morning on our series In Depth. Today, we are looking at teacher shortages across this country.
New this morning, we are getting a look at a new report that details a critical teacher shortage in Florida's public schools. Specifically, there's a shortage of certified teachers in areas English, math, and science.
We're seeing a stark shortage in education.
In a recent survey, 95% of all school superintendents said the teacher shortage was a significant issue.
It's been called one of the most important jobs of our time, but school districts are finding it more and more difficult to not only hire qualified teachers, but to get them to stay.
State leaders say about 5,000 teaching positions are open across Kentucky.
Many believe education is the essential building block for a child's future.
But more than half the schools in Illinois can't find teachers. The problem worries local educators and could impact your child.
As many students across the state get back to school, we wanted to know what is causing the shortage.
Today we begin the second year of Anchored in Education, and I think it is fitting we talk about the teacher shortage some more. We have touched on the teacher shortage many times on this podcast. In fact, some may be thinking we are beating a dead horse, but I disagree. We must keep this topic at the forefront of our conversations if we want to see any kind of change. It might even surprise you to know that out of the various clips I played, some date back as long as 4 or 5 years ago. And we probably could search and find some dating back 10 or more years. The teacher shortage has been ongoing for well over a decade now, and it continues to get worse. Often, not helping matters are meddling politicians who believe they have the next cure-all to the teacher shortage. You can probably guess how this works out in the end. In the last 5 to 6 years, some states have passed counterproductive legislation that not only ignores the teacher shortage, but often makes it worse through unintended consequences. In my opinion, one of these teacher recruitment roadblocks is edTPA. edTPA, now administered by the global education powerhouse Pearson Education, is being used in many states as a deciding factor as to whether a teacher candidate receives a license after completing their teacher prep coursework and student teaching. But I can feel a tangent or a major digression coming on, so let me take a minute to introduce our guest today. Dr. Drew Gitomer is the Rose and Nicholas DiMarzo Chair in Education for the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. Drew has contributed to the field of education with books, journal articles, technical reports, policy, and nearly 100 presentations. But it was a research article published on December 4, 2019 that caught my eye. The report, authored by Drew and 3 other colleagues, is titled Assessing the Assessment, Evidence of Reliability and Validity in the edTPA. The article even drew a published response from the developers of edTPA. We're going to talk to Drew today about that article and how they came to the recommendation of a moratorium on the high-stakes use of edTPA. Drew, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Oh, hi, Scott. Thank you for having me.
We're pleased to have you, and we're excited to talk about this topic. But before we get into that, I think we'd like to find out, really a little bit more about how you came to focus so much of your research on teacher assessment. Do you think maybe you could talk a little bit about how you came to study issues of teacher assessment and some of your important experiences that probably led you to what we are going to discuss today?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it a little brief. I'm getting old, so there's a long history here.
That's all right.
But, so when I went to graduate school, I actually studied cognitive psychology at the University of Pittsburgh, And it was there that we started thinking about just the general issues of could we think about how our theories of learning and understanding could affect assessment, and particularly how we could think about assessments not just in terms of classifying students or adults, but also in terms of providing ways of informing instruction in some ways. So once I left graduate school, I went to the Educational Testing Service, and I became involved in a number of projects where we started thinking about how assessment practices could better support teachers in their own classrooms. And so this work, we began to start exploring portfolio assessment, and more formative, what's become more used termed as formative uses of assessment. And so there I was working very closely in schools with teachers in a range of fields, from the sciences to art and music and language arts. And I moved from that work. I also then began to think about working in larger testing programs. So at ETS, I was able to work on the Praxis licensure exams. And I also became heavily involved in the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, and I was a principal player in the development of assessments and in designing scoring and also the reporting of assessment results. For the last decade, at least, I've been working on a number of projects to explore the measurement of teaching quality and using methods such as classroom observation, or using protocols to look at the kinds of assignments and assessments that teachers give to students, or examining teacher knowledge. So all of that work provided me with significant understanding of research on how to measure teaching quality, and also the ways in which data from different measures are analyzed and reported. And so all of that work, I guess, provided me with a kind of background that's the basis for the article that we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. And, let's just get right into that. We're going to be talking about, it's called the Educative Teacher Performance Assessment, but I think we probably recognize it more by its acronym, which is edTPA. More accurately, like you said, we're going to be talking about a recent research article you co-authored with 3 other researchers. So before we get into some of your findings, I think it is important to note that at its conception, edTPA had really a whole other purpose than how it is more commonly being used now, correct?
Absolutely. So edTPA was initially started and supported by the teacher educational community, and it was facilitated by the group that still is largely in control of this, the Stanford Center on Assessment, Learning, and Equity, or SCALE.
Okay.
And I think what was attractive to the teacher ed community was that the edTPA structure, it provided a number of conceptual and practical tools that programs could use to support students and to provide a way for programs to understand how their students were doing. So many of the design features of edTPA actually build on the work of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And in edTPA's first iterations, all scoring was done locally by the institutions themselves. And many institutions not only signed on, but were eager participants in its development. And so, but then edTPA became partnered with Pearson Assessments, and it became a high-stakes assessment.
Yeah.
And scoring was done not by those who actually had no connections to the program, and that changed both the process, but also the expectations for sound measurement. Because the assessment's now a determinant of whether someone can proceed to get a license, it's critical that standards of measurement are met. And so what, in any kind of high-stakes assessment like this, we turn to the APA, AERA, NCME standards of educational measurement, which is a document, a standards document that basically articulates what is involved with appropriate measurement and how we can provide evidence of the validity of those of a particular assessment for particular uses.
Okay, and then, am I not mistaken here that edTPA, it was never meant to serve as the deciding factor as to whether an individual could obtain a teaching license, right?
No, it was not a high-stakes assessment at all. It was very much meant for formative use within institutions so that they could better support students going into teaching, and they could also sort of monitor how well they were accomplishing their purposes and perhaps refine their programs.
Okay. All right. So we want to be clear that the article that you put out in the beginning of December of 2019, it was not a philosophical critique of edTPA. Instead, your article, quote, examines key technical properties of edTPA assessments through the narrower lens of psychometrics and validity theory, as well as professional standards for measurement and assessment. I'm hoping maybe you can explain how your approach differs from other critics and what the hopes were in taking this approach.
Sure. So high-stakes tests, and including tests of teaching, they're always going to be the subject of intense debate. People and institutions have different interests and often hold different values about the costs and benefits and how they vary depending on where you sit. So states, for example, feel that they can benefit if they have an assessment that provides some quality control on its teaching force. There's also an intent, at least stated by edTPA and many adopting states, that participating in the process will continue to help prospective teachers develop their craft as it was intended to do in its original incarnation. But there are certainly costs as well, not only the test fees, but also the time and effort that prospective teachers, as well as teacher education programs, have to put into the assessment, and perhaps doing that instead of engaging in other worthwhile activity.
Okay.
There's also potential costs in terms of professional anxiety and also potential costs in limiting who goes into teaching, especially when they might have been very good teachers. So most of the critiques of the edTPA to date have been around what we can think about as those values. Does it predict certain outcomes? Does it encourage teachers? Does it encourage teaching to the test practices that are really not helpful to teaching? Is it leading to the exclusion of individuals who want to pursue teaching, particularly individuals from underrepresented groups? So these and all these other issues are critical to debate, and that's the normal policy development process. But normal policy process requires that the information that policymakers have about the quality of tests is accurate and appropriate. And providing that information is really the sole responsibility of the assessment organization that develops, administers, and scores the assessment. Nobody expects a test to make perfect decisions. That's just not possible. There's always error associated with any assessment, particularly one as complex as the edTPA. But what is expected and absolutely required by educational standards of measurement is that such error or uncertainty be reported in as clear and appropriate way as possible. And the core issue for edTPA that we discovered is that they essentially claim that there's no error in their assessments, that the assessment is completely reliable and individuals will get the same score no matter who scores it. But they never report appropriate statistics that would inform users about reliability. And it's that deceptive information about the technical quality of the assessment that's the basis of our article.
Okay. And I mean, going out there to say that a test can be nearly perfect in providing results, I mean, that's a bold statement.
Right. And they don't, I mean, to be fair, they don't say exactly this is a perfect assessment.
Right.
But they do report certain numbers that have a certain sort of significance in the public discourse. And so when you say reliabilities or measures of agreement are 0.9, that gives you a sense of a highly reliable assessment. And I think they say that in their technical reports as well as their public materials, that they have a very reliable and valid assessment, where I don't think that evidence is there at all. And they haven't really ever reported on the reliability of the assessment in these technical reports.
Okay. Now, edTPA, it is a criterion referenced mastery test. And so Simply stated, prospective teachers get a score in a certain standard, and if they meet or exceed, then they are believed to satisfy that licensing requirement. But you would argue there is not sufficient justification for making a certification decision based on the score a candidate receives. Would you mind spending a few minutes talking about this?
Sure. So one of the important issues in any performance assessment, perhaps the most important issue, has to do with the reliability of raters and how that's going to affect the consistency of decisions in a test like the edTPA. So if I was the scorer of the assessment, hopefully the same outcome would happen as if you were the scorer of the assessment. And we can characterize that through measures of reliability. But the fact is that edTPA never reports reliability of the total test score. And that's ultimately the most important thing that matters. So instead, they report some very unusual statistics that are either invented or completely inappropriate given the nature of the assessment. And they manufacture these statistics so that the trusting reader will see what are implied as reliability numbers, as I said, in the 0.9 range. But these numbers, they're really not reliability estimates, and nor are the 0.9 numbers legitimate. We actually don't know what the reliability is because those data aren't available, but edTPA should know, and they have data that will give them much better estimates, and for certain, those estimates are substantially less than 0.9. You know, even the best trained raters will differ in their ratings of these kinds of performances. That's to be expected, but there are ways to address those problems through different scoring design approaches, and I'm not going to bore you and listeners with all of that. But edTPA doesn't employ a scoring design that could overcome expected rater differences, so that we know the scores will not be anywhere close to the reliability that they claim in the reports and in their public statements. And that misreporting is what violates the basic standards of educational measurement.
And so you report that many assessment organizations, you even mentioned these earlier, the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and Praxis, they report on standard errors of measurement to describe uncertainty. On top of that, other assessment organizations often report separate information for assessments in different subjects. But edTPA ignores standard practices and methods for determining standard errors, and they summarize the results across assessments of 27 different content areas. Would you mind speaking into why this needs to be a concern?
Right. So there's really two questions there. So let me try to pull them apart a little bit. The first one is around the standard errors. And for any assessment, you want to know how precise the scores are, because every assessment has a degree of uncertainty. And when we think of standard errors, I mean, one of the things that is sort of salient right now are election polls. And you'll read polls that say that somebody has X percentage of the vote, but there's a margin of error that's plus or minus some amount. And that's a standard error. Okay. And so edTPA uses a version of this statistic, but this version that they use is designed for traditional multiple choice tests that are scored right or wrong. And that's entirely inappropriate because it doesn't consider the possibility of human judgment error. So by the logic that they use, the edTPA is going to have the same precision, the same standard error, whether the portfolios are rated by a group of thoroughly trained experts or a bunch of people taken off the street. And of course, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we don't believe the standard error, the way they estimate it, is at all appropriate. The assessments themselves, so to go to the second question with regard to whether the assessments should be treated separately, I think the point is that these assessments are not the same. They're taken by different groups of individuals who have very different teaching challenges. I mean, obviously a kindergarten teacher and a high school physics teacher are not doing the same thing when they teach.
Right.
The assessments are scored by different individuals, and perhaps most telling, the mean scores and distribution of scores on these assessments are quite different. And educational standards make clear measurement standards make clear that under these conditions, such assessments must be treated as different instruments. And in fact, the assessments of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards does report results and analysis by field. And these analyses are conducted by Pearson Assessments. So this organization does, in fact, recognize the importance of undertaking the appropriateness of treating these assessments as unique, even when they follow a similar structure and are conducted within a larger coherent program. The inappropriateness, though, isn't only around aggregating the results. edTPA also recommends, and states have followed this recommendation, of setting a consistent test score, a consistent passing score across all fields. So let me give you an example to show you how problematic that is.
Okay.
If a state adopted the national recommended passing score of 41, and the scores were similar to the national patterns, the passing rate for middle school mathematics teacher candidates would be 79%, while the passing rate for secondary math teacher candidates would be 53%. So that's a big, big difference.
It is.
And what that implies is that middle school teacher candidates as a group are much stronger than secondary math teacher candidates. And I don't know of any evidence to suggest that's the case, but if scores and passing decisions are set in this way, then it's incumbent on edTPA to provide evidence that higher scoring fields have teacher candidates who are in fact better at their teaching than for candidates from lower scoring fields. And without such evidence, well, we have a common passing score, but it certainly raises issues of fairness and bias.
Now, the score, the national recommendation score, would that be the cut score? What we call a cut
Correct.
score? Okay. And so I want to just ask kind of this is to my home state here in Illinois, as we have edTPA, but I mean, they're looking at even raising that cut score even higher. From what I'm hearing right now, they definitely shouldn't be looking at doing that.
I would say you would be making more classification errors if you did that.
Okay.
To the extent that you have an assessment with lower reliability, you're protected to some extent, by having a cut score that is substantially actually lower or higher than the mean scores. When the cut score is close to the mean scores, you're going to have lots and lots of classification errors when you have an assessment of low reliability. And so mean scores are close to 41, perhaps. It depends on the field.
Right.
But by raising the scores, you would be bringing for most fields, you'd be bringing the cut score closer to the mean scores, which would mean you'd have more inconsistency of decisions based on the reliability of the assessment. I hope that's clear.
Okay. Yeah, no, it was clear to me. I hope it's clear to my listeners. Okay, Drew, the purpose of this episode is not a unilateral bashing of edTPA. I don't want people to think that. In fact, if they read your article, as I have, you and your co-authors give 4 arguments that could possibly defend edTPA as it currently exists. But even looking at these arguments, do you find it difficult to promote edTPA as the be-all, end-all to receiving a teacher license?
Well, I don't think any assessment should be the be-all and end-all for receiving a license.
Yeah.
And I don't think the standards would support that either. But we do lay out some arguments that could be and have been used to support the edTPA. And they all have some merit. But none of these potential strengths or uses absolves edTPA from reporting technical information about the test in an accurate and responsible manner. Policymakers can decide they're willing to tolerate certain levels of measurement error. In fact, that's always an important consideration. Policymakers may decide that the use of an assessment like the edTPA is better than the status quo. That's also their prerogative. But any judgments are compromised to the extent that they are working with deceptive information.
Okay, and you had, there was a response to your article from the, who did that come? It wasn't the test makers or who came up with it, but somebody responded to this. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe it was a joint effort of Scale and Pearson, the co-providers of the assessment.
And did they have good reasoning to your arguments that you made in your article?
No, we certainly didn't feel it was responsive at all to the criticisms that we raised. I think it was more a marketing
Sure.
argument, and they have talked about actually responding to the article in the journal, and I welcome that response. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I hope they would, so we could have a public discussion of these differences.
Okay. All right. Hey, before we go, we've got to talk about the recommendation of a moratorium on the high-stakes use of edTPA. And so tell us more about why lawmakers and officials should take this recommendation seriously and what needs to be done for edTPA to be used properly.
Right. So there's really, I think, two things that policymakers might have weighed when they make decisions. One is the quality of the technical quality of the assessment. And so we make the case that there are obligations of technical reporting that haven't been met. And to be clear, virtually all the work that we did is based on public information and technical reports. So we first think that there should be a moratorium because it's important to address the questions we lay out in the paper, reporting appropriately on reliability and precision and decision consistency.
Sure.
It's not optional. It's something that's a very clear requirement of these kinds of assessments by the standards. But of course, there may be other issues that are not readily apparent from the technical report. So a more thorough examination of relevant information certainly seems warranted. So the other piece is, though, that I think policymakers also rely on trusted authorities who weigh in on the quality of the assessment. And so given the prominence of the edTPA and the high-stakes nature of its use, it's important to have regular and independent vetting of the assessment. And typically, this is done by technical advisory groups of experts who examine the underlying processes and data more closely and provide critique and suggestions for the assessment program. Now, if you read the annual technical reports of edTPA, you will see claims that such a technical advisory group has reviewed the methods and data each year. And though we don't report this in the paper, what has become clear to us is that these claims are also highly misleading. These reports and the underlying data and processes have not been reviewed by the panel of experts that they name. And so this all came to light after the publication of our article through confidential but multiple sources.
Okay.
So we have policymakers who may have made decisions about the edTPA with two critical pieces of information. They've been told the assessment has certain technical qualities which are clearly not accurate. And second, they've been told that a group of trusted authorities has weighed in and confirmed the approach taken by edTPA. And that's simply not true. So until we can have more confidence and more clarity about the technical quality of the assessment, we continue to believe that a moratorium on high-stakes use of the edTPA is in order. 55,000 candidates took the assessment last year. Teacher programs are working really hard to make this work. And I think the least that we could expect is that basic standards of educational measurement are met when people are under this much pressure.
That seems like a reasonable request to me. The article is Assessing the Assessment, Evidence of Reliability and Validity in the edTPA. Drew, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Anchored in Education to talk more about this.
Thank you, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
Now, you can read more about Drew on my website, escottengland.com. I'm also adding a link to the full report from Drew and his colleagues. You can also find Drew on Twitter by searching at Drew Gitomer. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcast. I have said it before, I have seen many quality educators from the pre-edTPA era be successful, just as I have seen some educators be mediocre in the present edTPA era. This high-stakes barrier is doing nothing but keeping quality educators from getting into a classroom. Some might argue, Scott, edTPA has also kept low-performing teachers from entering the profession. Okay, I'll give you that, but I would argue with it as well. Just because someone is low-performing in the pre-service years does not mean they cannot be coached and mentored to excellence. In fact, I would further argue that part of the evaluation process in schools is to help teachers hone their craft. Why have an evaluation system in place if edTPA is supposedly only passing high-quality candidates? I'm sorry, but there is something majorly flawed with this. Drew brought us the research. Others present a very strong argument as to why edTPA needs to go as a teacher licensure requirement. Let's stop micromanaging universities and administrators in K-12 settings. No, I'm not asking for a watered-down teacher prep. I'm simply asking we remove unnecessary barriers. Let those who are trained to teach, shape, and certify teacher candidates do their job. And remember, at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.